Go. And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, as always. And today I am super excited to have an old friend join me for another show. Stephen Aryan is one of the most prolific fantasy authors that I know, and someone who writes books that I just thoroughly enjoy. And Stephen has a brand new series that is launching next month, and I thought this would be a fun thing to chat about. You know, Stephen, when you make these schedule these YouTube videos ahead of time, they make you put a title, and I'm terrible at guessing what a title should be, but I just guess that we'll talk about the modern state of
Yeah.
fantasy. And the Judas Blossom, your new book coming out next month. This is a bit of a departure from the books that you have written in the past.
Yeah.
First off, new publisher, new sort of subgenre, if you will, new characters. What was the inspiration for this new series?
Yeah. So as you say, it's been a while since we talked. It's been a few years. So I did 6 books with Orbit, all kind of
Right.
mages and wizards, and all very upfront and in your face, and very kind of lots of stuff going on. Then I moved to Angry Robot, and I did a duology, which is over my other shoulder there.
Right.
There. Anyway, there, The Coward and the Warrior, and that was a 2 connected stories that were reimagining the modern version of like a fantasy quest. I wanted to start with that basic trope and then do something a bit different and talk about other things and use that as a vehicle to do that. And I'm constantly wanting to challenge myself and test myself and do something different. And so then I thought about historic fantasy, and I started looking into it. I'd been watching some things, reading some things, thinking about it. And it's these ideas stew in the back of your head for years at a time. And this was ticking over. And I pitched it to my publisher and my agent, and they were very keen on it. And so then, yeah, we're kind of off to the races with this new historic fantasy trilogy. And without a doubt, it's been the most challenging series I've ever done in my entire life, which is good, but also really difficult.
Most people, I think, when you're not an author and you're not publishing, the idea is that it's like most things in life, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. The problem with that is that when you start a new book, everyone has the slate is wiped clean. The blank page is the great equalizer. No matter how many books you published, or your first one or your 9th one, in your case, you start with nothing.
This is
And that is, it becomes, I think it becomes more difficult the longer you go, because you have seen what you can do, and you want to keep stretching yourself, and you want to take on new challenges. And we've all, read authors that, kind of maybe rested on their laurels. And
you say, like, it feels like they phoned this one in, and I'm sometimes thinking, were they having a bad year? Were they just not feeling it, and they wrote it because it felt like it should? It was under contract, and it's that thing of,
or maybe maybe they took up golf.
But after like 30 books, and you're thinking, oh yeah, let's do another one of those or something. It's like, if it's constantly changing, or you're doing a new series, I get it. Like how people like Lee Charles have done like 24, 26 Jack Reacher books. I love those books. I'm slowly working my way through them. But equally, it's the idea of, another Jack Reacher book. What else can he go into space? No, because that's too far. So, how do you do it? With fantasy, at least we have the option of, it's a brand new world, it's brand new characters, it's a brand new setup. And we get to make it all up and start over again. The challenge is we get to make it up and start again. Because as you said, no one knows sometimes who you are ever until you become a household name. So the fact that this is my 9th book, some people are like, who? They're just finding me for the first time. It's true, like John Gwynne, when he brought out his Hunger of the Gods and Shadow of the Gods, people suddenly discovered it. And it's like, 10 years in the making, John's been putting out awesome books every year for the last few years, okay. Then they go back and read his other stuff. So I've no doubt some people will read Juice Blossom and go, has this guy written anything else? And they'll go back and see like, oh yeah, 8 other books since 2015. That's what he's been doing. Oh, we should look into his stuff. Please do.
Well, speaking of overnight successes, 10 years in the making, you published your first book 2015.
Yeah.
But you had been writing since around 99 or so, if I remember right.
That's right.
You know, and people will see that first published book and go to the bookstore and, oh, where'd this guy come from? He just lucked up, and they have no idea the years of toil that go into it. When you going from 99 to 2015, how many books did you write in that time? Or you know, this is one thing I find fascinating, Stephen. I'll give you some insight into why I'm asking this.
Sure.
Some people have a story that they want to tell, and they finish it and they try to get it published, and it doesn't go anywhere, and they just go back and they dismantle that book and they rework it, and they just keep working on that story over and over and over again until they find out what was wrong with it, or you know, put the polish, or maybe wait for the market to come around to where this book is, because sometimes it's just a matter of the book is great but the market is not ready for it, you know. And you just, these things have to line up. Other people, take Brandon Sanderson, for instance, wrote 13 books before he got published, and one wouldn't sell, and he would just, you know, pitch it in the closet and start another one. Which one of those camps did you fall into?
Same as Sanderson. Yeah, trunk novels. So in 99, I was a much younger man. And I was writing.
Weren't we all?
Yeah, this is 20 years ago. We're older than we look. I started young. I started writing novels young, and I thought it was good, and it was as good as I can make it at that time. But with every book, I got better and I learned more. And over the years, I was, you know, going to events, listening to agents, editors, publishers, trying to glean as much information about how they did it, how they got there. And, you know, I learned some stuff from them, but the end result, it boiled down to, you write a book, you make it as best as you can, you work on it. And if it's not good enough, you do another one. Because you're right, I've seen people going around events and they've got this one book that they had for 20 years saying, this is the one, this is the one. And that belief is good, but also it can blind you to the fact that it might not be the one, but the next one you write could be the one. So I'd written about 9 books, I think. I'd tried different genres. I'd tried crime. I tried different techniques. So I'm a planner by just what it works. I mean, I plan all my novels, not everything, but most of it, a framework.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, maybe it's because I'm not being spontaneous enough. Maybe I need to shake it up a little bit. So I wrote a book completely by the seat of my pants, finished it, and it was awful. It was terrible. But I thought I can fix it in the edits, and no, I couldn't. So that one, I didn't even try to send it out on submission. It was just not worth it. But for all the other ones, I'd write it, get friends to read it, I'd edit it over and over and over again. I'd send it out to agents, get rejected. Once I've gone through the list, that's it. There's nowhere else to go. And back then, self-publishing isn't what it is today. So I never considered it as an option. Now it's totally different. Everything's changed. But then it wasn't really a thing. So I just get my head down, put that book in the trunk, and go on with the next one. Try different genres, tried crime, tried horror, tried sci-fi. And it just, some things clicked, some things didn't. And gradually, by constantly reading, constantly writing, I found something that hit the right agent at the right time, that then hit the market at the right time. So I emailed and contacted my agent in 2013, and my debut came out in 2015. So, you know, sort of 14 years of trying before I got anything.
Wow.
Really. And then 2 extra years before it came out. So yeah, it took a while.
I'm so glad you brought up the topic of self-publishing, or indie publishing, as we like to call it nowadays. And you're absolutely right. It is 100% a viable option for a lot of writers. And I personally know a ton of writers that is, they have a very successful business that they run as as indie publishers.
Yeah.
One thing though that I think is that has kind of gotten lost a little bit is in traditional publishing, like you said, that wasn't a viable option at the time. So you put the book in a trunk and you try it again.
Yep.
A lot of people now, because indie publishing has become easier. Well, I'm never say that it's easy, but it's easier.
Easier. Yeah.
You can take that book that maybe didn't catch the eye of an agent, and you can publish it. And sometimes you can find an audience for that book, and maybe it's a sizable audience, maybe it's not. But there was a certain pause that happened with a writer when the book didn't sell, and you were forced to do some self-reflection and
Mm.
some ask yourself those hard questions about the book.
Yeah.
Is this book good enough? It might find an audience. It might sell thousands of copies. It might sell 20 copies, but am I best served by having this book out there? And I
Mm.
think a lot of indie authors have had to wrestle with this, that they rush to publish a book, and now it's out there on Amazon, and maybe a year or two later they're like, "Well, I really wish I wouldn't have published that book, because I'm so much better of a writer now than I was then."
Yeah.
And and we all get better as we go, and everyone's haunted by their back catalog at some point or another. But do you have any opinions about that, about because you are traditionally published and you have gone through all those steps? How do you see kind of people that have made the other choices, and maybe the ups or downs of it?
I think the biggest difference is, so if I go back and look at some of my older books now, I think I'll be quite embarrassed by them. I think there'll be things that I wouldn't like. It might be that the core of the idea is salvageable, that I could use to tell a new story, but I don't think any of the older books or could be reworked by themselves, because I wasn't the same kind of writer and I've learned a lot more.
Yeah.
So you're right. If you self-publish those books and they go out there, and then like in 5 years' time you go, yeah, that's not my best, you can now pull them off the shelf and take them off. Like, I can't do that with my old books. I can't take them
Right.
off the shelf and rewrite them and stuff. I know some of the bigger authors can, like Stephen King. He put out The Green Mile in 6 small chunks and it went out. I read it at the time, and then when he came to the collected version, he's like, there's some little mistakes here and there's little bits and pieces, and
Yeah.
he tweaked it. Stephen King also tweaked like The Dark Tower, the first book, and there are other people like that can do it. But if you look back at some of the older authors, so one of my favorite fantasy authors is David Gemmell, and his first book was sort of published in the early 80s. And if I go and read it now, like if he was still alive and he read it, I'm sure he'd be like, oh yeah, there's things I'm not happy about. But equally, I now look at the books that he wrote 20 years on from that, how good they are, how much he's learned. So it's one of those things that if someone goes back and reads a debut, you have to remember what era it was, because that'll affect some of the content. And also, was that person's first book or their 10th book or their 20th book, and look at how they progressed. So I think self-publishing is difficult in some ways, because you not only have to wrestle with those things yourself, you have to be your own businessman, businesswoman. You decide everything, you run everything as a business. And if you've got the time and the energy and the resources and the money to do it, then that's fantastic. But the other flip side is that it seems to be that people want self-published authors to put books out more often, more regularly.
Right.
Traditional is typically 1 book a year from an author. For most of us, that's kind of it. But
Yeah.
for self-published, they're like 2, 3, 4 books a year. And if you write a longer book, that's fine. Shorter books in certain genres work fine. So it's really, you still have to know the industry, you still have to know your genre, you still have to know your readers, you still have to know your competitors. So it's not just a case of just banging the books out as a self-published author. It's a lot of business stuff.
Yeah.
And as a traditional published author, I don't have the time, or I don't need to wrangle with some of that stuff, because it's taken care of by other people.
Yeah.
So there are pros and cons to both. I always say this. I never say one's better than the other when I talk about it on my YouTube channel. I say to people, it's what path you want to go. If you're a stay-at-home mom and you've got 3 kids and you get to write for like 5 hours a day, have you got time to do all the business stuff on top of it? Or do you want to, hand that off to someone else and they do it and try the traditional route? So it's fitting in with your lifestyle now as much as your existing resources, and then use your skill and your talent and your desire to tell stories on top of that.
Do you think that the quick nature of publishing, and you talk about how some indie published folks are putting out multiple books a year, and if you go to the Amazon store, there are just thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of titles in any particular genre. I still have books that I read, in my teens and 20s that mean a lot to me, and I, have them on the shelf here behind me, and
Yep.
I'll go back and reread them often, once a year, once every 2 years or so, and they've kind of become part of who I am. Do you think that the nature of publishing now is squashing some of that? Do you think that we hold on to books and hold them in with the sort of esteem that we used to? Are there too many books in publishing now for that to be as much of an issue?
I think people can find more because there's more books, and there's more books that are tailored to very specific subgenres. If you're looking for a specific thing, you can find it a lot easier now. Because of the internet, you can ask the question, and someone somewhere has read that kind of a book, if it exists, and they can tell you. And that particular book could be very, very particular and very special to a certain group of people, so that in 20 years, they will look back in the same way as I look back on the Earthsea books.
Right.
And just, how important. I've got the special hardback ones there that with the illustrations, because they mean so much to me.
Right.
But someone growing up now might read it and be like, I don't connect with it. I don't get it in the same way. I don't understand it. And they read something else that's more modern, that's similar, that has, that someone's closer to their background, upbringing, whatever it might be. So I think it's easier to find touchstone books now than it was before, not just because of the internet, but because there are that many more books being published. But on the flip side of that is it's harder to stand out. It's harder to get noticed because there are a lot more distractions now than there were. I keep saying this to some people, friends who've got kids. I have to explain to them what we did before the internet existed, and they don't really get it. They think we just kind of like sat around playing in the mud in the garden and
right.
I'm like, no, we go to the library and read books. I'm like, yeah, but what else would you do? Well, we watch TV. Yeah, but what else? I'd go outside and play.
Right.
Oh, so there's pros and cons for today.
I saw a video that you made a little while ago, and you were talking about because we didn't have the internet when we were younger. I think you were talking about your discovery of the Dragonlance series,
yes,
with Weis and Hickman, and how you didn't know this whole connected world and what they were doing, and all of that. But that's 100% true. When you discovered a series, like there was something magical about unearthing these little nuggets of information, and oh, this connects to this, and it was I don't want to go back from living in 2023. Don't get me wrong.
No,
but there was something great about there's a sense of discovery when we were younger that you just don't have now, because information is literally at your fingertips.
Yeah, as I said, it was hard back then. It was hard to find anything. The only way I would know if a new book was coming out was I'd walk into the bookshop every couple of weeks, and suddenly there's a new one on the shelf. I have no idea they're going to be there. I haven't had the press release, the email, the tweet, the Instagram post, the YouTube videos, the booktubers talking about. None of this existed. The only way is
you couldn't pre-order it a year ahead of time.
Yeah, it's magazines weren't as easy to get. Where they did exist, but it wasn't. It was once a month, and things change. So yes, you're right. There's that discovery phase of, unless I don't read a bunch of stuff in the industry, which I do anyway. The only way I'd have that spark of discovery is walking into a bookshop, start looking down the shelves and turning books over and reading the spine. And I get that sometimes, like there's stuff I've missed, or someone says, have you heard of this book? I'm like, no. And the next time in a bookshop, I see it and go, oh, that's what it is. And I turn it over and think, oh, that sounds interesting. But it's not the same. It's not the same kind of that rush of book 4's come out. I didn't know it was going to be a book 4. Oh my God, I thought it ended at a trilogy. What? It's just that childish delight, really. I think some of that's gone because the information's all there. It's all there.
Is it, it would seem that it's much easier to be a fantasy author when you have a decidedly English accent like you do.
It's one of the rules. You have to be English
So,
accent and a cat.
and a
That
cat. That see, I'm
I got
allergic to
two, so I'm
cats.
okay.
Yeah, I'm allergic to cats, so I
You could be a
guess,
sci-fi author then and have a dog.
well,
That's okay.
there you go.
You see?
Um, the your previous 8 books had more of the feel of what we would consider traditional fantasy,
Yeah.
of the sort of European flair, informed by European culture
Mm.
in a lot of ways. Your new series, that the Judas Blossom is the first book in, um, is takes its inspiration from Persian culture.
Yes.
What, tell me about why you decided to do that, and you have Persian heritage,
Yes,
if
I
I'm
do. Yeah.
Iranian. What made you want to connect with your culture in that way, and how difficult was it? We're also steeped in this European tradition of
Mm.
fantasy. Was it difficult to kind of stretch out in these new cultures, and to kind of build a world that maybe people aren't? I think for some fantasy series, because we're so used to these types of settings, it's easy to kind of fall in because
Yeah.
we expect certain tropes and we
Yes.
expect societies to be built in a certain way. Talk a little bit about just branching out.
Yeah. So you're my dad's from Iran. I was born there. My mum's English. I lived in England all my entire life. I've still got some family out there, but I haven't been there in 40 years.
Sure.
Um, in the last, I'd say 10 years, probably maybe 15, if I'm being generous, we started to see more non-traditional fantasy stories. Now they did exist because I spoke about, as you said, Weis and Hickman, and growing up, I read things like Rose of the Prophet trilogy that they wrote in the 80s, which
Hmm.
was completely set in a pseudo Middle Eastern setting. That was quite interesting. The fact that the Earthsea books, all the characters in it are people of color. It's never an obvious thing. It's never overtly mentioned, but that's part of the story. So there were things that I was seeing growing up that had echoes of things from my own mixed heritage that I could see. Even if it was someone like Tanis Half-Elven from the Dragonlance books, because he's
Right.
both human and elven, so he's from two totally different warring cultures that don't really get on sometimes. So there was bits and pieces, but in the last few years we've had books inspired by certain African countries. Evan Winter's done a sort of pseudo-African one. We've
Hmm.
got Sarah El Arifi who's doing one based on her mixed heritage. We've had Shelley Parker Chan doing She Who Became the Sun based upon her, Chinese heritage. And there are lots of others coming. And there's more that I haven't mentioned, of course. So that seemed that it isn't that fantasy fans are bored of that other kind of style. It isn't that there isn't room for them. It's just that having other stories out there with people who have links to certain cultures is becoming easier or more welcome, I guess, from an audience who don't mind trying something different, like to find out about cultures and customs and countries they've only read about or seen on the TV or don't know much about. So when I pitched it to my agent and then my publisher, they were very on board with it. The challenge then becomes, because it's historic fiction, as historic fantasy, sorry, it's not historic fiction, historic fantasy, there is a fantastic element in it. It's not as big as some of my others. There aren't massive wizards and things running around or dragons. It's very much set in Earth in the 13th century. The story starts in 1260. And all of the main tentpole events in the first book are based upon historic facts. They actually happened. Now, the timings are slightly off, and the people of who was there, I've had to massage. And also, sometimes like a war will start, and then 3 years later it finishes. I can't really have that in a book, the whole of it, because
Right.
otherwise I'd just be like, the war starts, and then it went on for a while. The war's over now, and I've just kind of summed up 3 years in a few chapters or paragraphs. It's like, you can't do it that way. So sometimes I've had to move things around because I want to tell this cohesive story that makes sense to the reader, that has satisfying payoffs.
Right.
Some of the characters are based upon real historic people. Some of them are completely fictional that I've made up. So all of that was going on. At the same time, I'm introducing readers to a part of the world they've never probably seen, they've never heard of. They certainly probably don't know much about 13th century Persia. I didn't until I started doing some research. So I've had to be careful. I have to try and find the balance of, I want to introduce as much information as I can so it feels different, that it feels somewhere you've never been before, that it's something that people can learn a little bit about as they read the story and enjoy it, without it feeling like it's just a history book saying, here's 12 pages about what kind of food they eat or this kind of custom. So I'm trying to find that balance the entire time of painting the picture so the readers get a clear image of what I'm trying to tell them in their mind, of the setting, the place, the food, the people, the dress, all of it. But also I want to carry them forward on the story. And that was really tricky. So when I said this was the most difficult series I've ever written, I'm not joking. I had to rework it and get feedback from my agent, and my editor sort of said, this is good, but it's slowed the book right down here. You need to kind of move things on or find a way to introduce that information later. So after 8 books and after 8 years or so, I thought this is the right time to do it for me. Trying to do this on my debut, there's no way I could have done it. I mean, if I tried it 20 years ago when I was first trying to there's no way I could have done it then either. I've learned a lot by being in the industry, but also by going through the process 8 times before this of pitching the initial idea to my agent, talking it through, writing a first draft, getting feedback, reworking it. So all of that, doing that over and over and over again in this traditional structure has taught me a lot too, that I thought I'm up for the challenge. Whether or not I've succeeded or not, that is the question.
We'll all find out next month, won't we?
We will.
When you begin a new, we'll say a new series, because books within a series will share certain of these touchstones. But do you first start thinking about the setting and the world, or do you start thinking about a character, or do you start thinking about a plot that you will inflict upon some characters within a world?
Inflict's a good word.
Yeah, and maybe a part B to that question would be, when you started this series and whole new world and whole new way of doing things, did that sort of process of creation change?
Yeah. So the creation part, probably answer that first, is I had to do a lot more research. There's some things, as I said, that are fictional, and there's elements that I've introduced that are fictional, but even the fictional bits are based upon something that existed. I've kind of extended it to, well, what if? But the research thing was writing this book was very difficult, in that I'd say, and then they walk into a valley, and then I'm thinking, okay, but what's growing there? What kind of animals were there? I don't know. What was around in this century? I don't know. What were the trees like? I don't know. So every time I start to write something, I have to constantly stop and go back and be like, oh yeah, right, let's do some research to paint the picture right, to get it fairly accurate. So that was difficult. Introducing people to a new world is always tricky. I started with the setting and some of the characters. I think I started originally, I knew that I wanted to set it in Persia, and then I started thinking, well, what era? And I'd been watching a couple of years before that the Netflix TV series Marco Polo, which is, I think it's still on most places now, and that is set in modern day Mongolia and China, and it's about Kublai Khan, and there are lots of stories and books about him. So my book is actually set in the same era as the stories of Kublai Khan and Marco Polo, but the other side of the world, essentially. So, and this is the thing, that part of the world in that period there aren't many stories about. And as far as I can tell, this is the first historic fantasy series set in this place and in this time.
Nice.
So that was different. So I knew I had the setting, I had the timing, and I knew some of the characters would come in, and I started doing research on who they were, and I found certain gaps. Like one of the main characters, it's not a spoiler because there's this history. One of the characters is a Mongolian princess called Kokachin, and she set off from Mongolia to come to Persia to marry the Khan who was ruling that area at the time. And Marco Polo traveled with her. Part of his job was to take her from point A to point B. It took 2 years for the journey. And by the time she got to Persia, the person she was going to marry, the Khan, was dead. His son had then taken over as the Khan, so she married him instead. And according to history, 3 years later, she was dead. And we don't know anything more about her, really. There's little bits and pieces here, but there's almost nothing. So there's a huge black hole. There's a huge gap. So I thought, okay, there's an interesting character who's gone through all of this.
Right.
What happened to her? What could have happened to her? What was going on? How would she feel from being forced into this marriage, essentially? And what does that make to a person? But then other main characters existed because they're based upon fictional people. And I didn't want to erase them. So I'm trying to make it historically accurate to a point, but also not. And then once I start playing with the timing and some of the big events that are going on, that inflicts some of the storyline already on the characters because I'm not changing too much of history, but then I introduce other wrinkles myself. So it all kind of came together as I started brewing it, the setting, the characters, the storyline. I added some of my own kind of like fantasy spice on top and mixed all of that in together. It sounds like I'm baking a cake, but it kind of is in a way.
It kind of is, yeah.
Yeah.
Stephen, does the modern I'm trying to think of the words I want to use to describe this, the modern implications of a place, does that ever factor into the fantasy aspect, or the historical aspect? Because if you say modern day Iran or Persia, our mind first goes to the CNN of it all, and and this is a culture that especially in the United States, where our cultural memory is about 250 years long.
Yeah.
And then you being in England, that cultural imprint is much broader than ours is. And then you go to a culture like Persia, and it's even that much
Thousands
longer.
of years old.
Thousands of years old. And whatever has happened in the previous 100 years obviously is on our minds, but that in no way has any bearing on the cultural impact of this place. So when you're dealing with a place that currently, people have feelings, about what goes on in other parts of the world, does that factor into the mining of this rich cultural heritage and the politics of a place like that, and what it was like 800 years ago, 900 years ago, as opposed to what we think of today? Does that factor in at all, or are you just looking for great ways to tell a story?
It's on my mind because I can't think about it without looking at the news and seeing what's going on with the protests and stuff now. It's hard to separate it at times because it's so evocative what you see in the news. All I wanted to do was try and tell an interesting story in a quite unique place, I think, that has this long history, that has thousands of years, as you say, of art and poets and history and culture. And what I'm trying to do, which is reflected in today, is introduce people to a part of the world that they don't know much about, but also give them a glimpse of the kind of people that live there, the spirit of the people, the passion of the people, how warm they are, and the stuff you see on the news versus what the reality is. And I think the best example from the last few years, he passed away, of course, now, is Anthony Bourdain on one of his Parts Unknown travel shows. He'd go all over the world and see things, and you'd think, I don't really know what this is about. And you watch it and think, that country's not like what I thought. He went to Iran, I think it was in 2014 or 2016, and he'd been trying to get there for years. And he finally went there. And one of the first things he said is, I've been all over the world. And I've never met such friendly people. Everywhere I go, people are saying, hi, how are you? They're smiling, they're happy. And he says, there's stuff to see in the news, and there's, people who are in charge versus the people out in the street that are just trying to look after their family, go to job, go to work, have a nice time. And so he got to see both sides of it, but he got to see some of the stuff that I'm trying to introduce, like the history, the culture, the food, because he's all about the food. He was, all about the food. And so Persian food is so good. So I do touch on that from time to time, but it's things like that. So I'm aware of what's in the news, very much so. And I'm trying not to talk about it. There's none of that in the book. It has to be within the era of which I'm writing. So in 1260, there's a lot of things that today we'd find quite abhorrent. The fact that, slavery still existed, and the trade routes and all sort of stuff, and the way countries were invaded and all these kind of things happened, and they were horrible, but it's a part of history. And I'm talking about history in that era, but also the people of that place who are the same people as they are today. So that's probably the only real connective tissue, I guess. I don't talk about religion of today and the politics of today in that era.
Well, it wouldn't be appropriate in
no, not within that
1300s
setting. Like someone said, why would you have slavery? Like, well, if I'm trying to be as historically accurate as possible, it's horrific and it's barbaric and it's upsetting, but it happened. So
it was very much a part of daily life for lots and lots of people.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the things that we love about fantasy is are the magic systems, and you wrote 6 books where mage is in the title.
In the title. It's right there.
In the title. It's very much about the magic systems. The Judas Blossom. This is historic fantasy, but it's rooted in actual people and actual events. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the magic systems or the choices that you were able to make, or maybe were hindered from making by writing a historical fantasy, but we all know you love magic systems.
I do, yeah. So there are some historic books. I think it's Pierre Perval wrote a book about historic France, and there's dragons on the front cover. So you know that while it's historic France, there's dragons. And it's like, okay, you accept it and you get on with it. This was more a case of,
who wrote the fantasy series about the French Revolution, but there are dragons?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the series. Someone will know it and will be shouting at us. But anyway. But that was straight away, you knew this is what you're getting. It's an alternate version of history. Mine's more of, it's focusing on the history and the politics and the warring and the turmoil in the area. And there's some espionage. There is a hint of magic, but it isn't the focus of the story compared to what I've done in the past. I've done big, loud magic. I've done that. So there are no mages wandering around in this series. There are no fireballs and lightning bolts out the sky. There is something there. I don't want to say what it is because it kind of spoils it, but it's not something that takes over and becomes the whole story. The story is the events and the people and how they navigate through all of these things that are going on. The magic is more like a whisper of something that happens around the edges. There's something happening. But even the magic system is based upon something that kind of exists, that I've just kind of gone off to one direction and thought, that'd be interesting to see what I could do with that. So it's not something I did come up with it, but I started with something that's based in fact. So I didn't want to have huge events be radically changed by magic within my series. Like there's a huge war and a wizard just comes out and plop, wipes out an army.
Right.
Like, if I wanted to do it, I could, but it's not as satisfying. It's not as interesting. I've done that kind of very fantastical thing. So it is fantasy, but the historic aspect is very much front and center. So less focus on the fantastic, more focus on the people, the world, the setting, and the espionage and the politics and the warring aspect, because that's so prevalent in that part of the world and in that era.
Right. I think most people are at least a little familiar with like the Arabian fantasy aspects and the jinn and some of those magical things that people can put in fantasy. And I don't know anything about Persian history much other than Bible stories from from Sunday school. But are there fantastical tales like the Jinn and like what sort of things were you able to uncover that you could weave in or pull from?
So that I grew up reading Greek and Roman mythology, mostly Norse mythology, and as I got older and went through the library, I read whatever I could find. But it wasn't until my 20s or even 30s that I came across Persian mythology, and the same sort of thing. They have thousands of years of history with books with fantastical collections of stories, and one of the best, most known is this one called Shahnameh, which is by it's got all sorts of stories of characters and monsters and heroes and villains and
Nice.
giant rock creatures and white demons and kings, and so it's there. It's been stories that are thousands of years old. They exist. I've borrowed little bits and pieces, but if I'd written it based upon that kind of a mythology rather than historic, it would have been a much more fantastical kind of stories, closer to what I've done before. So there are, spirits and demons and things in Persian mythology. They all exist in a similar sort of thing. They're different names. Some of the stories feel familiar. So we're all familiar with Hercules and his great trials and tribulations. They have a similar character who went through a number of challenges as part of his life when he became this great hero. So there are echoes all the way through that will be vaguely familiar to some people. It might be that in the future I do a story that leans more heavily into that and starts with the fantastical aspects. But this series has bits and pieces of things woven in, I'd say. You won't see demons popping out the ground or giant rocks coming down. But I could do a series, that starts with that kind of thing front and center again. Like instead of dragons, it's 13th century Persia, but giant rocks that everyone rides, these huge birds that are part of their folklore,
Oh, that would be awesome.
That would be awesome. The next one. No one steal that one. I'm doing that one next. Copyright.
Your previous series, Quest for Heroes, which was The Warrior and the Coward, was a duology.
Yes.
That was your first series that you wrote for Bad Robot, is that right?
Angry Robot, yes.
Angry Robot, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
And the new series, that the Judas Blossom, is the first book of The Nightingale and the Falcon. This is going to be a trilogy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm currently writing book 3 now. I'm halfway through. So yes, July for the next 3 years, these books will be coming out.
Nice. When you began this series, did you have a firm grasp on where book 3 was going?
Most of it, yes. Some of it, no. Because the further you go, the more I obviously went into my own story. And while I'm still tugging on parts of history and weaving through certain milestones, other things I'm ignoring more because I'm taking it in my own direction. So I knew what the end point was. I knew what I wanted to get to. But sometimes I'd come to like a junction and think, right, now I could take the more historic approach, or I could keep going on my own kind of route. And how much do I borrow and how much do I make up? So this third, and also tying everything up, all the characters, all the storylines, everything is a big challenge. But I'm getting there now. I keep kind of slowing down, rereading, tweaking what I've done, making sure I'm happy with it, and then moving forward to make it a satisfying end of the trilogy. But yes, next time I'm just going to do like a book about a boy wizard who goes to find his sword,
the chosen one,
the chosen something, a lot easier. Let's try that, next time. Jeez.
Well, after this series, do you think you'll return to this part of the world? Has creating a fantasy world out of the Persian culture has that kind of stoked the fires of imagination? Could you write one of those boy and wizard, chosen one stories, but set in ancient Persia?
Yeah, maybe that's the kind of thing, leaning into the more fantastical aspects and the magic systems and the great myths from legend of all their heroes that they have, that go back thousands of years. Maybe just, as you say, start with a trope that we all know. You set it in a completely different part of the world, and off you go. And it's never going to be what anyone expects.
Right.
So it might be that that's something I could look at in the future. But I think after such a research-heavy project, such a challenging project, because I have to adhere to certain parts of history, I didn't want to radically change things. I need a little bit of a change before I come back to something like this. It might be that I do another one a couple of centuries later, because things would have changed. I mean, you get these people who do a series and then they revisit it, and like 20 years, 30 years on, the characters are older, or the grandkids, or whatever it might be.
Right.
I could jump like 100 years and then do, the world would have changed again. I don't need to make it up. I can talk about some of the things that are happening again in 100 years time on from my story. So I think there's room to explore if the readers enjoy it, if they want to see more of this kind of thing, or more stories set in this part of the world. You know, I'd love to explore it and have that opportunity. But I guess it comes down to if they read it, and if I build it, will they come?
Well, you know, just do another trilogy with mage in the title. We'll all show up, and you know,
Persian mage. That's the next
the
one.
Persian mage. There you go. There you go. There you go. You heard it here first, folks.
That's it.
Stephen, I'm so excited about the new book coming out. We'll be sure to boost it when it comes out. For folks that are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you have done and will continue to do, where's the best place for them to find you online and, you know, sign up for the journey and go along with you?
Thank you. I definitely go to my website. It's stephen-aryan.com. I'm on Twitter at Steve Aryan. Those are the best places to find me, really. I'm pretty active on my website and on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, but I don't really know how to use it, what I'm doing, but I'm there. You know, pictures of cats mostly, and things like that. It's Twitter and my website are the best places, and it's got all the information on all my previous series in which reading order, because people always ask, where do I start? What do I start with? So yeah, all the information is there. New series starts in July. Trilogy takes me through to 2025, and later this year or next year I'll start planning and writing something new. So busy.
It all starts all over again.
Yeah, it does.
Stephen, it's so much fun to catch up. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, Hank. I really do.